Welcome to New Zealand Travel News, the segment where we go over the news that people looking to travel to or around New Zealand may care about. We are the team behind New Zealand's largest travel guide, NZPocketGuide.com. I am Robin, and this is Laura.
All right, let's get started with some just a quick travel news titled Queenstown Loses Out with Cancellation of the Winter Pride Festival. This was published on RNZ Radio New Zealand on the 28th of August 2021. One of the biggest festivals on Queenstown's calendar has been cancelled as a result of Friday's lockdown announcement. The 10-day Winter Pride Festival had already been scaled back when the travel bubble with Australia was closed, and again when the lockdown was announced last week. Organiser Martin King said he was still hoping to hold a 4-day event, but yesterday's announcement means it's no longer possible. King said the festival will be able to refund some of the ticket price. Most of it is non-refundable.
Yeah, so on Friday, it was announced that the South Island will move on to only alert level 3, which still prohibits big gathering events, and for this reason, this was cancelled. And that's basically the big news of the week, and that kind of a perfect segue into the main story of this travel news this week, and it's the fact that New Zealand's border are still remaining closed because there has been a little bit of a lockdown and outbreak here in New Zealand. And so what we decided to do right here, because that's the only travel news that we're going to be covering today, is this lockdown and what effect does it have on the New Zealand borders. We're going to go over a really good article on CNN, which covered pretty much the whole scope of this lockdown and its impact on the borders, and even the New Zealand psyche into COVID-19. And so we're going to go through the whole article, which is really long. We usually don't do that. We usually just do snippets, but we're going to go over all that, and it should give you an understanding of what this lockdown means for the New Zealand border opening. And I'll give a bit of our take on that at the end of that little segment. So bear with us. This is a very interesting article, and we're doing all the hard work. We're reading it for you.
Yes. Okay. So it's titled Delta Outbreak Tests New Zealand's Zero COVID Strategy, but lockdown has broad support at home. This is written by Julia Hollingsworth, CNN, with collaboration from Angus Watson. When New Zealand went into lockdown last week over a single Delta case, critics were quick to mock the country's risk-adverse approach. British newspapers didn't hold back. The Times called New Zealand a mysterious socialist hermit nation, where the public languish in a COVID prison, while the Telegraph slammed what a once welcoming country that had turned into an isolated dystopia. The reaction to New Zealand's approach speaks to a divide in how the countries across the world are handling COVID. More than 18 months into the pandemic, some countries, including the United Kingdom, have accepted they may never eliminate the virus, so instead they're learning to live with it. New Zealand, by contrast, is one of the few countries still committed to stamping out COVID. Hours after confirming the country's first Delta case in the community, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern ordered the entire nation into lockdown with the backing of a broad consensus across the political spectrum. 10 days later, the outbreak has spread to 347 cases, with one person in intensive care as of Friday.
So Fortress New Zealand, with some of the strictest restrictions in the world, has been breached. That's prompted questions over whether attempting to eradicate community transmission, known as the Zero COVID strategy, still makes sense in a world swamped with the highly contagious Delta variant. For now, Ardern is doubling down on the strategy, even as neighbouring Australia edges away from the approach. As for now, it seems that the public remains on board, even if it means being a hermit nation. But New Zealand's own COVID-19 response minister has indicated the approach may not last forever. The big question for New Zealand will be what its new strategy might look like.
All right, now we're moving on to what that strategy might look like, which is no urgency to reconnect. Until Delta arrived, New Zealand's tough border rules had protected it from the turmoil seen in most other countries. For most of the pandemic, the country has essentially operated as normal. Sports games, music festivals, public gatherings, and dining have all gone ahead, much the same way as they did before the pandemic. So far, New Zealand has recorded just over 3,000 cases and 26 deaths. But the comparatively low death toll has come at a cost. An estimated 1 million New Zealanders live overseas, nearly 600,000 in Australia, and many of New Zealand's 5 million residents have likely at least one friend or relative living overseas. Some haven't seen their loved ones in over a year. In March 2020, New Zealand closed its borders to almost all foreigners and later required almost all returning visitors to spend 2 weeks in managed isolation facilities at their own cost. Spaces are limited to around 4,000 rooms a fortnight, and just over 167,000 people have passed through managed isolation facilities since March 2020.
And those fortified borders have also created another major casualty, which is tourism. Once the country's largest export industry, overseas visitor arrivals slipped more than 98% in January 2021 compared with the year before. Despite that, New Zealand doesn't seem to be in any rush to reconnect with the world. There is even an us versus them mentality among some social media users who criticize overseas New Zealanders desperate to get home for not returning sooner. That's because many still believe that there is some upsides, that the upsides are worth it. A recent poll by public polling company Sticky Beak, sorry about that, found that 84% of people surveyed supported the decision to move into lockdown last week. A separate Sticky Beak poll showed only 1 in 4 wanted a travel bubble with Australia, which had allowed for quarantine-free travel between New Zealand and Australia to be reopened this year.
Okay, now let's look at how New Zealand has a different approach from Australia. New Zealand doesn't need to look far to know what can happen if the Delta virus takes hold. Neighbouring Australia, once a proponent of the zero COVID strategy, continues to battle a major Delta outbreak, recording another 882 locally transmitted cases in the state of New South Wales alone on Friday. One of Australia's biggest cities, Melbourne, has now spent nearly 7 of the past 20 months in lockdown, according to Australia Broadcasting Corporation's calculations. In the past few weeks, New South Wales Premier has conceded that the state will need to learn to live with the virus. Last weekend, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the country needed to change its focus from cases to hospitalizations, mirroring Singapore's tone in June when the city-state said it would need to learn to live with the virus. Under our national plan, when we start hitting the 70% and 80% vaccine targets, we can start claiming back what COVID has been taking away from us. And when we do so, we must not be intimidated by the case numbers that will inevitably increase, Morrison wrote in an op-ed distributed to local media.
All right, but New Zealand is in a different situation from its neighbouring Australia. While New Zealand went into national lockdown within hours from its first Delta case, New South Wales took 10 days to impose lockdown across Greater Sydney, and even then, the rules were more relaxed than what New Zealand had. By then, the contagious variant had taken a hold, leaving Australia with little choice but to recalibrate. And here's a quote: "Now they're struggling to keep it under control," the University of New South Wales epidemiologist Professor Mary Louise McLaws, an expert in infection prevention, said this week. "I can't see them getting back to zero. I think it's too late." And that's not the case in New Zealand yet.
Okay, Sean Hendy, a Country 19 modeller at the Auckland University, said the country's swift response would likely allow a return to zero COVID cases. Certainly with Delta, the idea is that you can ratchet up your response to Delta as the outbreak grows. That just simply hasn't been the case in New South Wales, he said. If you're able to pull it off, elimination was definitely the right approach, said Hendy. I don't think it's inevitable that we'll have a Delta outbreak that gets out of control. Epidemiologist Michael Baker, who advises the government on its COVID strategy, told national broadcaster Radio New Zealand this week that elimination has been the optimal strategy up until now, by every indicator we can use. Elimination is technically possible. It's being achieved across the region. I'm confident it will be achieved again in New Zealand, he said.
All right, so that brings us to the main question, for the post-COVID world, right? Is when are we going to drop the zero COVID strategy and start living with COVID? So the Australian Prime Minister Morrison has criticized the idea of pursuing an elimination strategy forever, calling it absurd. COVID is a new, different world. We need to get out there and live with it. We can't stay in a cave, and we can get out of it safely, he said this week. While New Zealand hasn't gone that far yet, New Zealand's COVID-19 response minister, Chris Hipkins, said the Delta variant raised questions about the long-term viability of the elimination strategy. And so he said, it does mean that all of our existing protections start to look less adequate and less robust, he said. As a result of that, we are looking very closely at what more we can do here. But it does raise some very big questions about the long-term future of our plans. Neither country is opening up right now, and doing so will be deadly. So after struggling to get supplies, New Zealand has one of the lowest COVID-19 vaccination rate in the OECD, with just over 20% of the population fully immunized. Australia, which also had some vaccine problems, isn't much further ahead, with only about 25% of the entire population immunized. The government figures put the number of fully vaccinated adults at 33%, and it's opening up its contingent on that figure, reaching 70 to 80%. That's for Australia. New Zealand has not announced any figures that they are targeting for, and they've been staying quite far away from announcing any figure they're targeting for. Now, but while Australia has signaled how it could move away from a zero COVID strategy over the next few months, there is little clarity about when New Zealand will do so itself.
Okay. Across the world, experts have said that COVID may be like the flu in the future, something that can kill, but something we can live with. Hendy has another comparison. Once New Zealand has high rates of vaccination, perhaps 70 to 80%, COVID could be treated like the measles. We don't lock down for the measles, but we also don't tolerate it in the community. We mount a public health response to eliminate measles when we have an outbreak. Earlier this month, a strategic COVID-19 public health advisory group said the elimination strategy could still continue, even after New Zealand reopens its borders. On its website, the Ministry of Health explains that it will use a combination of border rules, vaccinations, and public health measures to keep people safe from COVID. The country will still try to stamp out the virus, but it may mean it relies less on lockdowns. Our elimination strategy has proved its worth and remains an achievable goal even when the current border restrictions are eased, the Ministry of Health says on its website. In short, New Zealand is not planning to live with COVID in the same way as other countries. That may offer the potential for life to go on largely as it did before the pandemic, but it means the immediate future of it being mostly closed to the world.
So that's the end of the article right here. And as you can see, it was a very comprehensive article on CNN. I'll put a link in the description of this video if you guys want to look into it and read it yourself. But we read pretty much most of it. We just removed a couple of quotes that were just a lot of extra because we already talked about that article for about 10 minutes now. All right, so what is there to take out of this analysis, which is actually quite in-depth and quite good? First up, New Zealand is in absolutely no hurry to open up its border. So we did cover the big announcement that last month happened when the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, had kind of a look at what the future of the New Zealand borders might be. And, that was pre-lockdown, that was pre this outbreak, right? And so it does look like this will take a big back seat until things are under control in New Zealand, then things will happen as well. Now, is New Zealand looking for 70%, 80%, 90% vaccination rate before reopening its border? We don't know just yet. She absolutely refuses to say any number right now. They just say that they want as many people vaccinated as possible. Now, will New Zealand have stricter rules and stricter controls when coming to the country compared to other countries? Yes, it is likely that New Zealand will have stricter rules than other countries in the world for several reasons. First up, these have worked very well politically for the people in charge right now. The New Zealand public is very much behind this lockdown policy, this COVID stamping out policy, and everything like that. So the New Zealand public is very much behind it. And politicians, well, they tend to listen to the polls quite well because that's basically their bread and butter. So as long as the public is behind it, they probably will continue with that. Another reason is that New Zealand is the big gateway. It's a big hub for the South Pacific. There is a lot of islands in the South Pacific which pretty much have connection only through New Zealand and sometimes through Australia, right? So it's basically kind of buffer region between the South Pacific and the rest of the world. And for this reason, New Zealand doesn't only have a responsibility for its own citizens and New Zealanders in general, it also has a responsibility toward the South Pacific to keep it safe from any of the other disease that could happen or anything like that. So for this reason, our government is taking that even more seriously. So now what does it mean about people which are work visa and that want to come to New Zealand and all these things? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is not going to be any pathways to come to New Zealand, but it also means that there is not going to be any certainty for a long time to come. Now, the pathway may include having to stay in managed quarantine, having to actually have a proof of vaccines, any of those kind of things. Nothing has been set in place just yet. But one of the most important ways that New Zealand government is going to decide if you are allowed to come to the country or not is probably going to be the response from your country toward COVID and how your country is handling the pandemic. If your country has one of the most contagious variants ramping around the country, it is highly likely that the New Zealand border will be shut to people which have spent the last month over there. And it may mean that you have to go to transit countries, stay there, maybe, and then you can come to New Zealand. It may mean that if you are an essential worker, somebody which is critically needed in New Zealand, you can come to New Zealand, but you have to stay in the quarantine. Again, usually the quarantines are at your own cost, and the cost is usually about 3,300 New Zealand dollars. So there is a lot of conditions, a lot of hoops to jump through. So the hoops to jump through to come to New Zealand will be greater and will be greater both in hardness and in numbers as well. So so that's basically kind of what we're seeing as happening in the future. I think that it is safe to say that the announcement that we covered when New Zealand was talking about its different plan, with different tiers of countries and everything for reopening the border, this is still holding ground. This will still happen, but it may be pushed forward more, backward more in time, and it may only start in mid 2022, or depending on how New Zealand is handling that outbreak as well. Anyway, I hope that this insightful article gave you a little bit of understanding about the situation here in New Zealand. We thought we'd take the time to go over all that since there is not extra travel news right here, and I hope that our analysis of it as well help you understand if you can come to New Zealand or not. In the meantime, I hope that you did find this video useful. That wraps up this new segment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to reward all our hard work and to stay up to date with our video. Plus, check out nzpocketguide.com for thousands of tips, hidden gems, and much more. Let's go back to the live chat.